Mr. Katz. It's now my pleasure to invite to the dais Ambassador Eric Danon, Deputy Director for Political Affairs and Security at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of France. Ambassador Eric Danon is a diplomat working as the Deputy General Director of France's Ministry of Foreign Affairs since September 2016. He's the former CEO of the High Council for Education and Strategic Research and diplomatic advisor to Interpol. Dr. Danon, in his work as ambassador, permanent representative to the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva, has acted as the head of the French delegation to the NPT Review Conference in New York, to all multilateral disarmament and arms control negotiations, and to the negotiation of the Arms Trade Treaty. Dr. Danon is an experienced counter-terrorist. He was a visiting professor at the Paris University and is the former head of the Department of Counter-Terrorism and Countering Cross-Border Criminal Threats at the French Ministry for Foreign Affairs. The floor is yours, Ambassador, and it's great to have the Republic of France part of this conference.
Thank you, my dear friend, dear participants. Well, since the January 2015 attacks, France has been living in a profoundly different context. It has, of course, been the target of numerous waves of terrorism in the past. But in 3 years, from the declaration of Daesh to the recent fall of Mosul, France has been harder hit than any other Western country by the recent jihadist attacks, with 17 attacks out of a total of 51 in Europe and North America. This has led France to make counterterrorism an absolute priority. And this required a new strategy, which I am going to set out for you today. From the outset, the French authorities decided to choose a comprehensive strategy that means to simultaneously tackle the 3 levels of adversity facing us: the Islamist ideology, the armed jihadist groups, starting with Daesh, and finally, terrorists at home, whose profile and actions are constantly changing. Ideology first. Daesh's propaganda has proved very seductive for numerous young people in France. Its promise to bolster individuals' identities, give meaning to life, find one's true family, the Ummah, and providing access to paradise for those who die in the service of God, etc. It very quickly became difficult to create an effective counter-discourse to such arguments. When compared with Daesh's emotional communication, no rational arguments seem to have an effect on young people tempted by the jihadist adventure, except, occasionally, the views of repentant jihadis who have returned from the Daesh zone. Faced with such difficulties, the decision was made to take more directly operational measures. This concerned both the content and dissemination of the Islamist discourse. Let me give you some examples. The law now punishes on the dissemination of jihadist propaganda on the internet and any other media. The law authorizes police to block sites, dereference them, or withdraw content which is hosted in France. Significant progress has been made with providers on internet surveillance, which needs to continue. We talked about that this morning with Facebook. This work has also enabled us to close websites, block propaganda videos, and conserve data to facilitate the work of law enforcement services. What is more, the law now criminalizes calls to jihad combat. On this basis, certain Salafi mosques have been closed, and several particularly trenchant imams have been removed. Incidentally, the issue of training imams has been reconsidered. Now, the second level regards the fight against Daesh and Islamist organizations. As you know, France is the second largest contributor to the international coalition, providing more or less the same commitment as the United Kingdom. We are carrying out armed interventions in Iraq and Syria. But our troops are also engaged in the Sahel region and in sub-Saharan Africa, particularly in Mali. We fully support cross-border initiatives such as the G5 Sahel framework, and we are involved in a great deal of security and defense cooperation work to help certain countries fight terrorism, such as the fight against Boko Haram, Libya, and Lebanon as examples, as are many countries in sub-Saharan Africa. You know this already. But the key now is to anticipate what will happen after Daesh, and we have to adapt our strategy accordingly. Daesh will probably be beaten militarily by the end of the year. But the terrorist organizations of the Levant, such as Al-Qaeda or Daesh, are constantly adapting, changing, and reinventing themselves. This means that they never die completely. The terrorist groups' alliances are currently in the process of being completely renewed as the territory of the caliphate becomes more and more restricted. This reconfiguration is happening both for Sunni fighting organizations and the Shiite militias, which have developed greatly during the conflict. With the defeat of Daesh, we are now at risk from acts of terrorism committed by those returning from Syria and Iraq, or if they are incarcerated, that they will spread Daesh's ideology from their prison. In France, a majority of the population remains largely and consistently supportive of our overseas military interventions. The debate is more focused on their consequences. In particular, military interventions that were initially focused on fighting terrorism have gradually become the vector for a new geostrategic confrontation between powers. The shift of power now concerns a very vast area, which goes from Libya to Iran and from Turkey to Yemen. The future is uncertain, of course. Who can predict here with certainty what Syria, Iraq, Libya, and Yemen will be in only 1 year or 2 years' time? Who knows what the respective power of the United States and Russia, but also Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Iran will be? There are many issues for France. The security issue with terrorism, but also the migration issue, regional stability, and defending our economic interests in the area. I would now like to address the third level of our strategy, France itself. I have 3 preliminary remarks. But the links between terrorists at home and Islamist organizations over there, be they ideological or operational, can exist in any form, direct or indirect links, attacks ordered, inspired, or later claimed by these organizations, action procedures which can be centralized or decentralized, elaborate or rudimentary, etc. Second, a sort of jihadist community, both connected to and separate from the world around it, has developed in France, as it has in other European countries. It has developed on the internet and in the real world, in certain suburban estates and disadvantaged areas, Salafi mosques and Islamic schools run by preachers of hatred, as well as several of France's prisons. Third, against a background of economic difficulties, this jihadist ecosystem has taken its place in French society, which is troubled with very sensitive issues of identity, sectarianism, integration and social inclusion, secularism, Muslim representation, etc. Incidentally, this context has made it very difficult to come up with the de-radicalization process. At this stage, the experiments carried out in this respect on young people that are in the process of being radicalized or who have returned from Daesh zones have produced disappointing results. So what measures have we actually taken? Several laws have been added to the counter-terrorism operation, which last underwent considerable change in the 80s. It has been a 3-pronged approach. Firstly, intelligence. While the efficiency of intelligence is obviously crucial, our country does not have a counter-terrorism intelligence service as such. The National Intelligence Coordination for all services concerned, of which there are over 20, which is directly attached to the French presidency, has thus been bolstered. That was for the French presidency, of course. On the ground, we are building or rebuilding significant detection and surveillance capabilities, like, for example, the creation of a penitentiary intelligence service to detect radicalization in prison. Detection has been made more difficult as there are fewer and fewer typical terrorists and predetermined radicalization patterns. We are faced with individuals who often have a standard delinquent background, but rarely religious militant backgrounds, and they are being radicalized in increasingly short time spans. We recently came to the idea of asking psychiatrists to flag up patients which they believed were at risk of putting it into practice. Secondly, numerous initiatives, nearly 100, have been implemented to allow judges and police officers to be more effective, such as the time allowed in custody, interception of communications, increased sentences, including for indirect accomplices, improved detection of terrorist financing and surveillance of social networks. Furthermore, recruitment and complicity in recruitment for jihad is now a criminal offense. We have also worked on trying to stop French citizens leaving for Daesh areas, particularly via Turkey. Lastly, these initiatives have been bolstered further under what we call the state of emergency, l'état d'urgence. This intensification has led to questions over the balance between security and freedom. In the end, it has been relatively well received by the population, and in November, it will be integrated into the standard legislation. The issue that has provoked the most debate has been the deployment of significant military presence in urban settings. The primary objective is to protect sensitive sites, such as places of worship, schools, stations and airports, and touristic spots. Some believe that military presence on our streets has indeed boosted the sense of security. Others look at the cost of an initiative which has failed to prevent terrorist attacks and which has turned deployed soldiers into targets. In addition to the detection and law enforcement initiatives, we must also act to reduce the number of individuals susceptible to take action. This brings us into measures which affect our society as a whole, such as education, culture, professional training, and access to employment. There are three reasons behind this. First, in the majority, jihadists no longer come from abroad, but are French or have been living in France for a long time. Those likely to commit acts of terrorism are now on French soil. Second, the motivation of those who carry out terrorist attacks on French soil is largely linked to their personal frustration regarding their life in our country, where they feel like they cannot find a place. They know virtually nothing about religion and even less about the situation in the Middle East. Third, we do not know whether the jihadist community will be able to grow once Daesh has been beaten militarily. From Paris to Barcelona, from Berlin to Brussels, Manchester, London, perpetrators of terrorist attacks seem to have become more or less autonomous and remember the preaching of al-Adnani, former spokesman for Daesh, to kill the enemies of Islam as soon as possible and with any available means, firearms, gas bottles, knives, or cars. Conclusion. 3 take-home messages. Since 2012, we are part of a new cycle of terrorism. This cycle will not end in the near future. Daesh will be militarily defeated, but beyond this, jihadist Islamism will live on, and we must continue to fight it. It is impossible at this point to deal with all the causes and roots of this terrorism. There are multiple causes, both on a global and local level. 2, France will overcome this cycle of terrorism as it has overcome others in the past. Many of the measures that need to be taken have already been identified, and objectively, their implementation is being improved day by day. That said, our strategy is not set in stone. Radical Islamic terrorism is constantly evolving in its procedures, its means, its communication, its financing, etc. And we must adapt to this. Third and final, following the attacks, people started the welcome process of analyzing the dynamics at play in French society. This means we must come back to basics, know who we are, and hold on to it. Affirm the desire to build our future without being victims of it. Make the choice in accordance with our history of a multicultural society which remains open to the world and stands resolutely against sectarianism. And if you will allow me to voice my own opinion, personally I'm confident. I'm convinced that the path that France has chosen has enabled us to reach a consensus about security issues while remaining the embodiment of humanism, fraternity, respect for others, and empathy, without which France would lose the most valuable aspect of its message to the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. And now from across the English Channel, it's my pleasure to introduce a member of the distinguished delegation from the United Kingdom who has come here with some other